The night was warm and full of music in Lagos, Nigeria. Cars worth millions lined up outside Chief Ibrahim Danjuma's mansion for his big retirement party. Inside, the chandeliers sparkled, laughter echoed, and everyone wanted to be seen with the famous real estate tycoon. Among the crowd stood his 27-year-old daughter, Amira Danjuma, quiet, kind, and always the one people forgot. She wasn't the favorite. That spot belonged to Zainab, her father's glamorous daughter from his second wife. When Chief Danjuma took the microphone, the room went silent. With a proud smile, he called Zainab forward and announced his final gift, $10 million to start her own business. The crowd erupted in cheers. Zainab posed for pictures, her diamond bracelets flashing under the lights. Amira stood nearby, clapping softly, her heart beating fast. Maybe, just maybe, her father would say something kind to her too. But when she stepped closer, he looked at her and laughed. "You," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You're a dreamer with no sense. You'll never succeed." The guests chuckled. Zainab smirked. Amira froze, her cheeks burned, her throat tight. The laughter felt like knives. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the mansion, past the shiny cars and the golden gates. Outside, the night was quiet. She looked up at the sky and whispered to herself, "Maybe I don't have millions, but one day they'll remember my name." Then she walked away, not defeated but determined. The morning after the party felt colder than usual, even though the Lagos sun was already blazing. Amira woke up to find the house staff carrying out her boxes. Her clothes, her books, even her sketch pads, all thrown together carelessly. When she tried to ask what was happening, her stepmother, Madame Hadiza, appeared at the doorway with her usual fake smile. "You should thank us," she said sharply, crossing her arms. "Now you'll finally learn what life is like without our money." Amira felt her throat tighten. "But father, your father has made his choice," Madame Hadiza interrupted. "This house is for family, real family." Those last two words hit her like a slap. Amira didn't cry. She just picked up one of her boxes, walked out of the mansion, and stood at the gate where she had been humiliated the night before. The guards looked away awkwardly. No one offered help. That evening, she took a bus across town and rented a tiny one-room apartment in Makoko, a crowded, noisy neighborhood near the water. The place was small, damp, and smelled faintly of smoke, but it was hers. She laid her sketchbook on the floor, sat by the window, and promised herself she'd never depend on anyone again. Days turned into weeks. Amira found a part-time job at a small cafe, wiping tables, taking orders, saving every naira she could. The work was exhausting, but it kept her going. Customers came and went, and sometimes she'd doodle quick sketches on napkins when business was slow. Dresses, jackets, head wraps, all inspired by the people she saw every day. Market women in bright colors, fishermen with weathered hands, children running barefoot through the streets. At night, when the lights went out, she would light a candle and draw for hours. Her hands were rough from washing dishes, but her mind burned with ideas. Her designs were bold, real, and alive, nothing like the empty luxury her father loved to show off. Some nights, hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she didn't let it break her. She'd whisper to herself, "This is the fire I needed." She started saving for fabric, visiting local markets to study patterns and textures. People began noticing her drawings, neighbors, cafe regulars, even a tailor nearby who said, "You've got something special, girl." Amira smiled for the first time in weeks. For the first time in her life, she wasn't living in her father's shadow. The world had taken away her comfort, but it had given her something more valuable, purpose. She still remembered her father's words, "You'll never succeed." Every time she felt tired or hopeless, she'd repeat them silently, not as pain, but as fuel. Because deep down, she knew this exile wasn't her ending. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. One hot afternoon, while Amira was serving coffee at the small cafe in Makoko, a young man walked in with a camera hanging around his neck. He was tall, with kind eyes and a calm smile. His name was Tunde Adewale, a freelance photographer who often came by to take street photos and sip cheap espresso. That day, he noticed Amira sketching during her break. Her hands moved quickly, lines flowing into beautiful shapes. Long gowns, bold head wraps, powerful African silhouettes. "Wow," he said, leaning over the counter. "You drew that." Amira looked up shyly and nodded. "Just ideas. Nothing serious." Tun laughed softly. "Nothing serious? That looks like something I'd see on a runway." She blushed. "Runways are for rich people. I'm just trying to survive." Over the next few days, Tund kept coming back. They'd talk about art, dreams, and life. He told her about a small design contest happening in Nairobi, a chance for young African designers to showcase their work. The winner would get funding and mentorship. Amira laughed when he suggested she join. "I can't even afford to fix my fan," she said. "How would I go to Kenya?" But Tun didn't back down. A week later, he showed up at her apartment, holding a printed flight ticket. "What is this?" she gasped. "It's your chance," he said, smiling. "I sold my old camera. You believe in everyone else's dreams, Amira. Maybe it's time you believe in your own." Tears welled up in her eyes. No one had ever done something like that for her. She hugged him tightly. "I'll make you proud," she whispered. When she arrived in Nairobi, her heart pounded with fear and excitement. The contest hall was filled with designers from across Africa, confident, polished, many with full teams. Amira stood alone, clutching her portfolio. Her designs told stories, powerful women in bold colors, fabrics that spoke of strength, struggle, and beauty. She called her collection Unseen Queens. When it was her turn to present, her voice trembled at first, but soon passion took over. She explained how her designs were inspired by ordinary African women, the ones who built families, carried water, and still managed to smile. The judges listened intently. Some nodded, some scribbled notes. When the results were announced, Amira didn't win. Her heart sank a little, but she smiled politely, clapping for the others. She told herself it was enough that she'd even made it there. As she packed up her sketches, one of the judges, an elegant woman in a white suit, walked over. Without a word, she slipped a small card into Amira's hand and whispered, "You have something rare. Call me." Amira looked down. The name on the card read Layla Mbeki, founder, Pan-African Fashion Incubator. Her fingers trembled as she held it. For the first time in a long while, hope didn't feel like a fantasy. It felt real. Amira sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the small white card in her hand. Layla Mbeki, the woman who had whispered, "You have something rare." For days she kept it safe inside her sketchbook, too afraid to call. What if it led nowhere? What if she wasn't ready? But one evening, as the sun dipped below the Makoko rooftops, she took a deep breath and dialed the number. A warm, confident voice answered. "This is Layla." Amira introduced herself nervously, reminding her of the contest in Nairobi. Layla immediately remembered. "Ah, yes. The girl with the bold designs and the fearless eyes," she said with a smile in her. "I've been waiting for your call." Layla invited her to join a small fashion incubator program she ran for young African designers. It wasn't fancy, just a shared workspace, a modest grant, and access to mentors. But to Amira, it felt like a miracle. She packed her sketches and flew back to Nairobi, determined to make every moment count. The next few months were grueling. Amira worked day and night, sometimes sleeping on the studio floor. Her hands were constantly covered in thread and fabric dust. She had no fancy equipment, just an old sewing machine, scraps of fabric from street markets, and her imagination. But her vision was strong. Her designs mixed African heritage with modern elegance, Ankara patterns with sleek silhouettes, traditional headwraps styled like crowns. Layla watched quietly, impressed by Amira's discipline. "You design like you've lived 100 lives," she once said. Slowly, things started to change. A local online magazine featured her work under the headline, "The Girl Stitching Her Dreams." Then a few bloggers wrote about her brand, which she had named Amira by design. The orders came slowly at first. One dress here, two there. But every time she shipped a package, she whispered a little prayer of thanks. One day, everything changed. A famous South African singer, Naledi Khumalo, wore one of Amira's dresses to a music awards show. The dress, a fiery red gown with gold beadwork, lit up social media within hours. Fans flooded the comments asking, "Who designed this?" By morning, Amira by design was trending across Africa. Emails poured in. Fashion editors wanted interviews. Investors wanted meetings. Brands wanted collaborations. Amira could barely keep up. She stood in disbelief as her phone buzzed nonstop. From a one-room apartment in Makoko to global recognition, it felt unreal. But even with fame knocking on her door, Amira stayed grounded. She still remembered the laughter that night at her father's mansion, the sting of his words, "You'll never succeed." Now, she didn't need to prove him wrong with anger. Her success was her silence speaking louder than any insult. As she looked at her growing team, her new studio, and her name shining on magazine covers, Amira smiled softly. "They gave me nothing," she whispered, "but I built everything." Back in Lagos, things weren't as golden as they once looked. Zainab Danjuma's glamorous life, the luxury cars, designer bags, and endless parties, was beginning to fall apart. The $10 million inheritance that once made her feel untouchable was vanishing faster than she could spend it. She had opened a high-end boutique in Victoria Island, but she knew nothing about business. The rent was outrageous, the staff untrained, and the clothes overpriced. Within a year, the boutique shut down quietly, its windows covered with "for lease" signs. Still, Zainab kept up appearances. She posted old photos on social media, pretending everything was fine. She smiled at galas, dressed in borrowed gowns, while creditors sent her messages she didn't dare open. Deep down, she knew the truth. Her money was gone, and so was her shine. Meanwhile, Chief Ibrahim Danjuma refused to see reality. In family gatherings, he still bragged about Zainab. She was always destined for greatness, he would say proudly, sipping his wine. And when someone mentioned Amira's name, usually after spotting her brand Amira by design on TV, he'd scoff and laugh. Even if she's doing well, she'll never match Zainab's name, he'd declare, waving a dismissive hand. But his empire wasn't as strong as he made it seem. One of his biggest real estate companies was in trouble, bad deals, unpaid loans, and partners pulling out. For the first time in his career, Chief Danjuma felt the ground shake beneath him. Banks stopped returning calls. Investors backed away. One afternoon, while meeting with his lawyers, he overheard a conversation that made him pause. Two business associates were discussing a new company from Kenya, Amira Holding, that was buying shares in multiple African real estate firms, including some of his. The company was growing fast, with deep pockets and powerful connections. He chuckled when he heard the name. Amira Holdings? He said mockingly. Funny coincidence. My useless daughter is named Amira too. The men laughed politely, not realizing the irony. But the more he heard about this mysterious company, the more curious he became. The name kept popping up, in magazines, on business reports, even at international conferences. Amira Holdings was everywhere, making quiet but bold moves across the continent. At night, Chief Danjuma sat in his office, staring at the numbers on his failing accounts. His pride wouldn't let him admit it, but something inside him whispered that karma had come knocking. Far away, in a bright office in Nairobi, Amira was reviewing investment proposals with her team. Her company had just acquired a major real estate project, one that once belonged to her father. When she saw the name Danjuma Properties on the document, she smiled faintly. She didn't say a word. No press release, no announcement. Just quiet satisfaction. The same way her father had once laughed at her, the universe was now laughing back, softly, poetically, and perfectly. 2 years later, Lagos looked different, or maybe it was Amira who had changed. The same city that once felt like rejection now welcomed her with flashing cameras and luxury cars trailing behind. She stepped out of a sleek black convoy, wearing one of her own creations, a flowing gold gown that shimmered under the evening light. Reporters rushed forward, calling her name. Her face had been on magazine covers across Africa. Her brand, Amira by Design, had become a symbol of strength and elegance. That night, she wasn't just attending a gala, she was the guest of honor. The event, hosted in one of Lagos's grandest hotels, was a charity fundraiser celebrating Africa's young innovators. The crowd was filled with politicians, business moguls, and celebrities. The air buzzed with admiration and curiosity. Everyone wanted a glimpse of the woman who had built an empire from nothing. Amira walked gracefully through the hall, smiling at familiar faces. Cameras flashed, whispers followed her every step. But in the front row, one man sat frozen, Chief Ibrahim Danjuma, her father. His eyes widened in disbelief as he saw her name on the giant screen behind the stage, honoring Africa's rising visionary, Amira Danjuma. He looked around, speechless. The same daughter he once mocked was now being celebrated by the same elite he once ruled over. Zainab sat beside him, dressed in a fading designer dress, her once glittering confidence dimmed. When the host called Amira to the stage, applause filled the hall. She walked up slowly, calm but powerful, every movement radiating grace. Taking the microphone, she looked out at the crowd, her eyes briefly meeting her father's. For a second, time seemed to freeze. Then she began. 2 years ago, she said, her voice steady, I was told I'd never succeed. I was told I was just a dreamer, that without money, I had nothing. The audience went quiet. But tonight, she continued, her smile gentle but strong, I stand here not because of inheritance, but because of faith and fire. The entire hall erupted into applause. Some people stood up, clapping and cheering. Cameras flashed like stars. Zainab looked down, tears forming in her eyes. For the first time, realizing that arrogance couldn't buy legacy and money couldn't buy respect. Chief Danjuma sat still, his face pale and unreadable. Pride and regret battled inside him. The daughter he had laughed at had become the woman the world now admired. After her speech, Amira thanked the audience, then walked off the stage with quiet confidence. Outside, she stood beneath the night sky, breathing deeply. The city lights reflected in her eyes. She had returned, not to prove anything, but to show what self-belief could create. Her revenge wasn't loud. It was elegant. It was success, the kind that spoke for itself. After the gala, as the night lights of Lagos shimmered outside, Amira received a message she never expected. It was from her father, Chief Ibrahim Danjuma. His words were short but heavy. Come home. We need to talk. She stared at the message for a long time, unsure whether to laugh or cry. 2 years ago, he had thrown her out like she was nothing. Now, after everything she had built, he suddenly wanted to see her. After some thought, she agreed. Not for closure, not for him, but for herself. The next evening, she arrived at the same mansion she once left in tears. The gates opened slowly, and the guards, who once looked away from her, now greeted her with respect. The house looked smaller somehow, emptier, the sparkle gone. Inside, her father sat in the living room, his once commanding presence dimmed by time and regret. Zainab sat quietly beside him, her eyes red from crying. "Amira," Chief Danjuma said softly, his voice trembling between pride and guilt. "You've done well, far better than I expected. Perhaps you can help me. Some of my companies are struggling. Maybe we could rebuild together." Amira looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was calm, but her eyes carried years of hurt. "You once laughed when I had nothing," she said quietly. "You called me a dreamer with no sense. You didn't just cut me off, you made me feel worthless." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. "You taught me value," she continued, her tone steady. "But not through love, through rejection. And I learned to survive without you." Zainab burst into tears. "Amira, please." "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I was cruel. I thought being chosen made me better. But I lost everything Father gave me, and you built everything he took from me." Amira's face softened. She stood and walked toward her sister, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I forgive you, Zainab," she said sincerely. "You were just living the life I once wished for. But now I don't envy it anymore." Then she turned to her father, who sat silently, his pride shattered. "Forgiveness isn't weakness," she said, her voice firm. "But I won't fund my humiliation. The same hands you pushed away built an empire, and I built it without you." The room fell silent. Chief Danjuma's eyes glistened, but he said nothing. The weight of regret filled the air. Amira picked up her purse and walked toward the door. Before stepping out, she looked back one last time. "You once told me I'd never succeed," she said softly. "But look at me now, not because of your money, but because of your doubt." Then she walked out, not broken, not bitter, but free. For the first time, she wasn't leaving in pain. She was leaving on her own terms. Months passed, and the once powerful name Chief Ibrahim Danjuma began to fade from Lagos's business circle. The man who once owned skyscrapers, estates, and companies was now drowning in debt. His empire had crumbled, one company after another, until there was almost nothing left. Investors pulled out, banks took back properties, and the same people who once begged for his attention now ignored his calls. Rumors spread fast. The Danjuma fortune was gone. The man who mocked others for being small dreamers was now the one being whispered about in pity. Zainab couldn't take the shame. With creditors chasing her and her luxury life in ruins, she quietly left for London, trying to start over. Her social media went silent, the sparkle in her photos gone. Meanwhile, far from the chaos, Amira's world was only growing brighter. Her brand, Amira by Design, had become a household name, worn by politicians' wives, artists, and even international celebrities. But Amira's heart wasn't just in fashion anymore. She wanted to create something that went beyond success, something that helped others like her. So she launched the Fire Within Foundation, a program that gave grants and mentorship to young African women with big dreams but little support. From tailors in small towns to students sketching designs in notebooks, Amira helped them turn their ideas into real businesses. She visited local markets, hugged mothers who reminded her of her own struggles, and spoke at schools about courage and self-belief. Reporters loved her story. They called her the girl who rose without a fortune. But to Amira, it wasn't about fame. It was about giving meaning to everything she had endured. During one television interview that would later go viral, the host asked her what she thought of those who once doubted her, the people who said she would never succeed. Amira smiled calmly, her voice steady and warm. "When people say you'll never succeed," she said, "thank them. They've just handed you the fire to build something they can't destroy." The audience clapped softly, but the clip exploded online overnight. Within hours, millions of young Africans were sharing it with the caption #FireToRise. It became a movement, a message of strength for anyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough. In the following months, Amira's foundation funded hundreds of small businesses across the continent. Her face appeared on billboards with quotes about resilience and hope. She became not just a designer, but a symbol of possibility, proof that rejection could be the greatest gift of all. And somewhere in Lagos, in a quiet, nearly empty mansion, Chief Danjuma watched one of her interviews on TV. He turned down the volume and stared at the screen, his reflection faintly visible beside her. The daughter he once called a dreamer with no sense had become the dream the entire continent now looked up to. Weeks turned into months, and whispers began to spread through Lagos once again. This time, not about power or success, but about sickness. Chief Ibrahim Danjuma, the once untouchable businessman, was now lying in a private hospital room, fighting for his life. His empire was gone, his home quiet, his phone no longer ringing with people asking for favors. For the first time in decades, he was completely alone. The man who once filled boardrooms with his booming voice could now barely speak above a whisper. The monitors beeped softly beside him as nurses came and went, their faces polite but distant. His pride, once larger than his wealth, had melted into regret. Every night he stared at the ceiling, haunted by the faces he'd hurt, especially one, Amira. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the hospital walls in a soft orange glow, the door opened quietly. A familiar figure stepped inside, graceful and calm. It was Amira. Dressed in a simple white suit, she didn't look like the young woman he'd once mocked. She looked like peace itself. Chief Danjuma blinked, unsure if he was dreaming. "Amira," he breathed, his voice weak and shaking. She walked closer, her heels silent on the floor. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was heavy with years of pain, pride, and unspoken word. Finally, he broke the silence. You proved me wrong," he whispered, his eyes glistening. "You became everything I said you couldn't be." Amira smiled softly, taking his frail hand in hers. "No, father," she said gently. "You proved me right, that we don't need money to have worth. We just need belief." Tears rolled down his cheeks. His once strong hands trembled in hers. For the first time, there was no power between them, no anger, no bitterness, only truth. Amira sat with him quietly, letting the silence speak more than words ever could. The machines kept beeping softly, and for a brief moment, it felt like time had paused to let them both breathe. After a while, she stood to leave. She placed a plain white envelope on the table beside his bed. "This will cover your hospital bills," she said softly. "Not because you owe me anything, but because I've learned that kindness ends cycles pride can't." Chief Danjuma looked at the envelope, then at her, his lips trembling. He wanted to say more, to apologize, to ask for another chance. But his voice broke before the words could come. Amira gave his hand one last squeeze and smiled faintly. As she walked out of the room, her reflection passed over the glass, calm, strong, radiant. Outside, the evening breeze carried a quiet peace with it. She didn't need to look back. That visit wasn't about revenge or proving who won. It was about closure, the kind that doesn't come from triumph, but from forgiveness. For the first time, Amira's story wasn't about what she had lost or gained. It was about what she had finally set free. A year later, the name Amira Danjuma had become more than a brand. It had become a movement. In Nairobi, hundreds of young women gathered for her first live event, titled Built from Fire. The hall buzzed with excitement as girls from across Africa, students, designers, dreamers, filled every seat. Some held notebooks, others clutched handmade sketches, all waiting to see the woman who proved that starting from nothing could lead to everything. When Amira finally walked onto the stage, the room went silent. She wasn't dressed in glitter or gold. Instead, she wore a simple white dress, soft, elegant, completely her own design. She looked confident yet humble, the kind of presence that made everyone feel seen. Behind her, a large banner read, "Success isn't inherited, it's created." The crowd erupted in applause. Amira smiled, her eyes glistening. "A few years ago," she began, "I was told I'd never succeed, that without money I was nothing. But I learned something powerful. They can take your comfort, your title, even your name. But they can't take your will to rise." As she spoke, you could feel the truth in her voice. She wasn't performing, she was remembering. Women in the audience nodded through tears, inspired by her story of pain turned into purpose. Later that evening, after the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, Amira walked alone toward the ocean. The sky burned orange and pink as the waves kissed the shore. She carried her sketchbook, the same one she used back in her tiny room in Makoko. Sitting on the sand, she flipped through the pages, designs born from nights of hunger, hope, and heart. She smiled softly at the horizon and whispered, "They gave me rejection. I turned it into riches." The wind carried her words out to sea, as the camera slowly panned upward, showing not just a woman who won, but a woman who became. Her story was never really about revenge anymore. It was about rebirth, resilience, and the quiet power of believing in yourself when no one else does.